Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the life of the most dangerous woman America ever tried to own. Not dangerous in the way they want you to think. Not loud, not reckless, not raging at the ceiling. Dangerous in the quiet, specific, irreversible way. Dangerous because she could disappear into a marsh at midnight and leave no trace. Dangerous because she kept coming back. Dangerous because no reward poster and no patrol and no court of law ever managed to close the distance between where she stood and where she was going. Tonight, we are spending the full night with Mother Harriet Tubman, the entire life, from the dirt floor cabin where she was born on the eastern shore of Maryland, to the home for the elderly she founded in Auburn, New York, where she eventually died at approximately 91 years old, having outlasted, outrun, outmaneuvered, and outworked every single thing the world threw at her. And I want to be clear about something before we begin. This is not a story about a face on a coin. This is not a classroom poster. This is not the soft-focus, lantern-in-the-dark version of this woman that gets handed to elementary schoolers and left there. Harriet Tubman carried a gun. She led an armed military raid that freed more than 700 people in a single night. She had brain surgery without anesthesia and bit on a bullet because they offered her sedation, and she said no, she was fine. She fought for the right of women to vote well into her 80s. She spent decades broke, petitioning the United States government for compensation it would not deliver for 30 years. She did all of this with a brain injury she'd had since she was 13, an injury that sent her into sudden unconscious spells for the rest of her life, an injury she described as God speaking to her directly, because she was also a woman of extraordinary and unbreakable faith. This is that person, the full one. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And drop a comment telling me where you're tuning in from tonight, and tell me honestly, do you think you could have done what she did? Could you have gone back? I want to know. The comments section on a video like this one is always something else. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. Maybe pull the blanket all the way up, because some of this is going to require you to feel it. And some of what you feel is going to be heavy, but it should be. The best history always is. Let's get curious for a second. Have you ever wondered what it would feel like to wake up one morning and understand, truly understand in your body, and not just as an idea, that your body is someone else's legal property, that the labor of your hands belongs to a stranger, that the children you might have will be born into the same arrangement, that the law of the land, written by men who called themselves free, says this is correct. Have you ever wondered what kind of person looks at that arrangement and decides, quietly, at the age of 6, that it is wrong and that she will not accept it? Have you ever wondered what it takes to walk 90 miles through the dark, through swamp and forest and river crossing, on nothing but starlight and determination, carrying the full weight of knowing that if anyone catches you, the consequences are worse than simply dying? Have you ever wondered what happens to a brain that gets struck by a lead weight at 13, that starts sending its owner visions and voices she comes to understand as God? And how that brain, damaged, seizing, navigating a life that would break most people whole, ends up being the most reliable navigator the Underground Railroad ever produced. Have you ever wondered what it feels like to be free, truly and legally and permanently free, while everyone you love is still back there? Have you ever wondered what kind of love makes a person go back into the thing that enslaved her 13 times, knowing that capture means torture and possibly death? And have you ever wondered what happens to a woman like that when the war ends and the country wants to declare victory and move on. And she is not done. She's nowhere near done. She is building a home for elderly people who have nowhere to go, and she is fighting for women's suffrage, and she's still doing the work. Congratulations. You've just woken up in the year 1822 in Dorchester County on the eastern shore of Maryland, in a one-room cabin that belongs to a family named Brodess. And everything in this cabin, including you, is their legal property. You don't know the exact date. You won't know it your whole life. The people who own you don't make a practice of recording the births of their enslaved, not with the care they would record the birth of a foal or a calf whose value they intend to track. What gets written down about you is the equivalent of inventory: approximate age, approximate value, anticipated years of productive labor. Your birthday is yours, but what yours means here is complicated. Nothing here is quite yours, not even your name. Your name right now is Araminta Ross. Everyone calls you Minty. Your mother is Harriet, Rit to most people. And she is a cook for the Brodess household, a woman of such fierce maternal love that she will one day plant herself in a doorway and dare a slave trader to come through her to take her youngest child. And the trader will back down, and her child will stay. That child will grow up to be your little brother Moses. Your mother is the kind of person who makes possible the kinds of people she raises. You will understand this more as you get older. Your father is Ben Ross, and he is owned by a different man, a farmer and timber operator named Anthony Thompson, whose land sits not far from the Brodess property. Ben and Rit are enslaved by two different families. Their marriage exists across the boundary of two separate legal arrangements, two separate ledgers, two separate men who consider them assets. They see each other when the paperwork allows. They have 9 children together: Lina, Mariah Ritty, Soph, Robert, then you, Minty, then Ben, Rachel, Henry, and Moses. And each of those children is born into the same impossible arithmetic. Parents who love each other and who love their children, divided by a system that has no mechanism for loving anyone. Your mother's mother, a woman named Modesty, arrived in America on a slave ship from Africa. From where in Africa, nobody knows. That knowledge, the country, the people, the language, the name she had before, was stripped in the crossing. But things come through anyway. Not the official things, not the documented things, but the things that live in the body. The way of moving, the way of watching, the way of reading water and weather and the faces of dangerous people. Your grandmother sits with you when you are very small, and she doesn't tell you where she came from, because she doesn't have that language anymore. But she tells you other things. She tells you to pay attention. She tells you that the land will talk to you if you listen. She is not wrong. The eastern shore of Maryland is, in the 1820s and 1830s, a landscape defined by water in a way that marks everything that happens in it. The Choptank River, the Blackwater River, the tidal flats and the marsh channels and the creeks that fill and empty with the tides in ways that no map printed on paper can fully capture, because the map changes twice a day. The boundary between land and water here is not a line. It is a negotiation, conducted fresh with every tide, shifting with the season and the weather and the mood of the bay. A child who grows up navigating this landscape learns that the apparent path is not always the real path, that what looks like solid ground can be 3 feet of mud at low water, that patience and timing matter more than speed. This is not a bad education for someone who will eventually be navigating the slave patrols of 3 states in the dark. The Brodess property sits in this landscape. It is a moderate-sized farm operation by Eastern Shore standards, not the vast plantation machinery of the Deep South. but a working agricultural property that uses enslaved labor across a range of tasks: domestic work, field labor, timber cutting, dock work along the river. The Brodess family is connected to the Thompson family through the marriage of Mary Paddison Brodess to Anthony Thompson, which means Harriet's parents, both enslaved by different members of this extended family, move in the same geographic and social orbit without quite being in the same household. Her father Ben, owned by Thompson, works timber. Her mother Rit, owned by the Brodess operation, works in the house. Their children are her mother's property's children, which means they belong to Brodess. This is the architecture of it. A family whose love is real and whose claim on each other is complete, but whose legal status is divided, distributed across the ledgers of different men, subject to being altered by those men's deaths and debts and decisions. Harriet grows up watching her parents navigate this architecture, the careful maneuvering required to maintain family bonds inside a system designed to disregard them, the constant vigilance required to protect a family that the law does not recognize as a unit deserving of protection. She absorbs the lesson. You hold together what you have by whatever means you have, because the alternative is losing it to a system that cannot see what it is destroying. The free black community of the Eastern Shore forms a crucial parallel world to this enslaved existence. By the 1840s, approximately half the black population of Maryland's Eastern Shore is legally free, a proportion that is unusual in the slaveholding South, and that creates a social complexity that defines the environment Harriet moves through. Free black men work alongside enslaved men on the docks and in the timber operations. Free black women attend the same churches as enslaved women. Free black families live on farms adjacent to the properties of their formerly enslaved or still enslaved relatives. The line between free and enslaved is real and legal and consequential, but it runs through families, through communities, through dinner tables and church pews, in ways that make it impossible to pretend the free world and the enslaved world are entirely separate. This means that the Underground Railroad in this region is not a secret network hidden from the black community. It is something the black community knows about, participates in, sustains through the same networks of mutual aid and communication that hold the community together in every other circumstance. Word moves through these networks. Information about which roads are patrolled, which white families are sympathetic, which routes through the marsh lead, where this information circulates in the way that essential community knowledge always circulates, through conversation, through code, through the signals that people who live under surveillance develop for sharing what they need to share without the surveillance noticing. Harriet has been inside this communication system since childhood. She will eventually become its most accomplished conductor. The cabin is cold in winter. The Eastern Shore of Maryland has a particular kind of cold, not the dramatic cold of the mountains, but the wet, low, seeping cold of flat tidal country, where the water is everywhere and the dampness comes up through the earthen floor and settles into your joints before you finished waking up. You learn early to position yourself near the fire. On the worst nights, you sleep with your toes practically in the ashes, not in the embers, just close enough to keep the blood moving, to keep the cold from getting all the way down to the bone. Your diet is mostly cornmeal, pone baked flat and hard, mush boiled soft and bland, and sometimes salt pork, and sometimes, when the tidal creeks are running and your father gets the time, fresh fish. On those days, the cabin smells like something alive, something actual. And the difference between eating to survive and eating something that was cooked with care is a difference you notice even as a very small child. Your father Ben is your first education in the world. He manages timber operations on Thompson's plantation, which means he spends his days in the forests and the wetlands, and he has developed a relationship with the land that only comes from years of careful, attentive work. He knows which trees fall which way. He knows where the water moves underground before it surfaces. He knows which plants can be eaten, which ones are medicine, which paths through the marsh look like walls to a stranger but open up for someone who knows to look at the water level. He doesn't make a lesson out of this knowledge. He just brings you along, and you watch, and you absorb. This is how the most important education of your life is delivered. Not in a schoolroom. Enslaved children in Maryland do not go to school. It's actually illegal to teach them to read. But in the woods, at your father's side, watching a man who has been forced to serve someone else's interests with his body while quietly building something irreplaceable in his own mind. The 6-year-old who gets sent to Miss Susan's house carries something with her that no hiring arrangement can touch. The specific physical knowledge of what her mother's love feels like, and what her father's teaching has given her, and what the marsh sounds like in winter when the birds are gone and the ice is forming at the edges of the channels. These are her private property in a world where she has no other kind. No one can hire them out. No one can sell them. They live in her body, in the way her feet know where to step and her ears know what sounds mean, and her nose knows what weather is coming. She takes this knowledge to Miss Susan's house, and she keeps it there, intact, through every morning of being hit, and every night of rocking a baby who is not hers, and she does not lose a single piece of it. When she is sent to check the muskrat traps in the creeks, she is in her element in a way that no one at the Brodess property quite understands. They think they are punishing her with the outdoor work. She is being educated. The muskrat traps teach her timing, what time of day to check them, what signs tell you a trap has been sprung, when to wade in, and when to wait for the water level to drop. The marshland teaches her silence, how to move without disturbing the surface, how to become a shape that the birds don't startle at, how to be still in a landscape that rewards stillness. She is not thinking, at age 8 or 9, about escape routes and cover, and the art of moving through hostile terrain without being detected. She is thinking about muskrat traps, but the skills are the same. The skills are exactly the same. Her father Ben has an arrangement with Anthony Thompson that gives him a degree of operational autonomy, unusual in the slaveholding context. He manages the timber operations, which means he has to exercise judgment and leadership and make decisions in the field that his enslaver has delegated to him. This is not uncommon in the skilled labor sectors of the slaveholding economy. A man whose skills you need has more leverage than a man whose only value is raw labor. And Thompson needs Ben's judgment about timber in the same way that any employer needs the judgment of someone who is better at the job than they are. Ben uses this autonomy carefully and strategically. He builds relationships among the free black community. He builds relationships with the Quaker families in the region. He builds, in essence, the social infrastructure that his daughter will plug into when she needs it. He never calls it infrastructure. He just keeps his eyes open and his relationships warm and his word reliable. And when his daughter eventually needs the network, it is there. You are 6 years old the first time you are hired out. Edward Brodess, the man who holds your mother's papers, and by extension yours, sends you to live with a woman named Miss Susan, who needs help caring for her infant. You are the help. You are 6. Miss Susan is the kind of woman who understands the system she has inherited and uses it with the thoroughness of someone who has never been asked to question it. Your job is to rock the cradle through the night when the baby cries, to keep the household running, to make yourself useful in the way that a piece of equipment is useful, consistently, quietly, and without requiring any consideration of your own needs. When the baby cries and you don't respond quickly enough, Miss Susan hits you. When you fall asleep from exhaustion at 4 in the morning after rocking a cradle for 6 hours, she hits you. When you fail to satisfy some expectation she has communicated in a way you don't fully understand, she hits you. You are 6 years old and you are learning what the world costs, and the price is your body, and there is no one in this house who is going to intervene. What Miss Susan does not understand, what the entire system of slavery is structurally incapable of understanding, is that Minty Ross is paying attention. Not the flinching survival mode attention of a child waiting for the next blow, though she is doing that too. She is cataloguing, she is mapping, she is building in the interior of her mind a record of the world around her. Who lives where, which roads go which direction, which people seem safe, which sounds from outside mean danger, and which ones are just the natural sounds of the night. She is 6 years old. She's already building the map of a person who might someday need to leave. She goes home eventually. She goes to another hire. A man named James Cook is supposed to teach her to weave. She is bad at it, impressively, perhaps deliberately bad. And Cook sends her outside to check muskrat traps in the creeks instead, which is cold and wet and miserable, and also exactly where Minty would rather be. The marsh of Dorchester County is a living thing. It breathes. It shifts with the tides and the seasons. The channels that look impossible to cross at high water reveal their passages at low. The trees and the reeds have their own language, if you know how to listen to it. She is not learning this marsh by accident. She is memorizing it with the seriousness of a student who already knows the final exam. She comes back to Brodess eventually. She works in the fields. She hauls timber with her father. She drives oxen. She plows. Work that is meant for grown men. Hard, outdoor, heavy work. And she discovers something about herself in it. She is built for this. She is small. She will never grow past 5 feet 2. But she is compact and dense with strength. Built like the landscape she grew up in. Able to take on weight that ought to bend her and come through the other side intact. The men around her notice. Her father notices. He teaches her everything he knows about timber, about the weight and fall of trees, about reading a landscape for what it will do before it does it. She learns to swing an axe with accuracy. She learns to move through the woods without making noise. She learns to ford water at the right moment. She is not yet 20 years old, and she is building a body and a knowledge base that will carry 70 people to freedom. And then, somewhere around 1835, when she is maybe 13 years old, the thing happens that will rewrite everything. She is inside a dry goods store near Bucktown Village, a crossroads community not far from the Brodess property. An overseer comes in, angry. These men are always angry. Anger is the primary currency of their profession, the one tool they are never without. And he spots an enslaved man moving through the store, making for the door. The overseer grabs something from the counter, a 2-pound iron weight, meant for the scale. He aims it at the man who is running. He misses. The weight strikes Minty Ross in the head. She drops where she stands. The wound is serious enough that she cannot be moved for some time. She is carried back eventually, to which cabin, whose care exactly how she spends those initial hours, history has not fully recorded. And what is clear is that she lies unconscious for days. Some accounts suggest weeks. The skull is cracked. The pressure builds. Nobody sends for a doctor. She is enslaved, and the calculation, made somewhere above her insensible body, is that she is not worth a doctor's fee until they know whether she'll recover. She lies on the floor. Her mother tends to her. The people who own her wait to see if she will be an asset or a loss. She recovers, but Araminta Ross does not come back from that injury the same person who went in. For the rest of her life, for the next 78 years, she will experience sudden, uncontrollable episodes where the world simply drops away. It happens without warning. She can be mid-sentence, mid-step, mid-anything, and then the dark comes in from the edges, and she is under. And when she surfaces again, seconds or minutes have passed, and she is somewhere slightly different, the world having moved on without her. Historians and neurologists who study the historical record have suggested temporal lobe epilepsy as the most likely diagnosis, though narcolepsy and cataplexy have also been proposed. Nobody can be definitive across this distance. What can be said definitively is this: she navigated 90 miles through hostile slave territory alone in the fall of 1849. She went back into that territory 12 more times. She did all of it knowing that her brain might simply turn off without notice at any moment. She did all of it anyway. The head injury also reshapes her relationship to time. The sleeping spells, the sudden involuntary disappearances that come without warning and last seconds or minutes, mean that she lives in a different relationship to the continuous present that most people experience as normal. For her, the present is interrupted. It can stop without notice and resume somewhere slightly different. This is disorienting. It is also, in its own way, a kind of training. She has to operate in an environment where she cannot rely on continuous consciousness, where she must build systems robust enough to survive gaps in her awareness, where the people around her need to know what to do when she goes under, because there may be a moment when she goes under at the most critical possible time, and they need to keep moving. She prepares them. She tells the people she leads, "If I go to sleep, don't wake me. Wait, I will come back. Keep going in the direction I showed you." She always comes back, and she always knows where they are when she does. Her visions during the sleeping spells are specific and useful in ways that pure subconscious processing cannot fully account for, or can, depending on how you theorize the human brain's capacity for rapid environmental integration. She sees faces. She sees paths. She sees dangers before she encounters them. In one of the most frequently cited accounts, she describes seeing a flying vision, herself flying like a bird over a landscape, able to see the route ahead, able to see where the safe ground is and where it is not. Whether this is divine revelation or a brain that has learned to process spatial information with extraordinary efficiency during its enforced rest periods, the practical result is the same. She wakes up and she knows things that she didn't know when she fell asleep, and those things are reliable, and she acts on them, and people survive because she does. But here is the thing about the injury that gets missed in the straightforward telling of it: the visions. After the head wound, Tubman begins experiencing what she describes as visitations, not nightmares, not confusion, but clear and specific and instructive communications from God. She sees landscapes before she walks through them. She is warned away from danger through the dreams that come during these involuntary sleeps. She is shown paths. She is given specific and actionable information that turns out, repeatedly, to be correct. She understands these experiences as divine guidance, and she follows them without question for the rest of her life, and the results are unambiguous. She never lost a passenger, not one. You can choose your interpretation. You can say, a woman with a traumatic brain injury developed heightened pattern recognition and an extraordinary ability to process environmental cues at a subconscious level, cues that surfaced as visions. You can say, God spoke to a woman who needed directions and she listened. Both explanations produced the same outcome. The people she led got home. She is put back to work almost immediately after the injury. The headaches are constant. She is 17 or so, in the fields, hauling timber, checking traps, the blood still crusting at the edge of her hairline, and she is working. She will spend the rest of her life working through the pain. You will understand, as the story goes on, that this is not metaphor. She literally will not stop. Now let's talk about John Tubman, who enters the story around 1844, because he is important to understand, even though his role in Harriet's actual escape is essentially the role of an obstacle. John is a free black man. And again, pause on what that means in Maryland in the 1840s, where roughly half the black population is free. Free black people in the slaveholding states exist in a condition that lawyers might call legally ambiguous and that everyone else would call terrifying. You are free on paper. You carry papers proving it. You know that those papers can be questioned, confiscated, declared fraudulent by the wrong white man in the wrong mood, and that the legal structures around you are not reliably interested in protecting you. You have built a life. You have reasons to stay. The calculus of freedom for a free black person in a slave state is not simple. And John Tubman's eventual refusal to leave Maryland should be understood in that context, even if it can't be excused. Harriet and John marry around 1844. She takes his name, and she takes her mother's first name, leaving Araminta behind permanently. She becomes Harriet Tubman, the name she will carry into history. It is interesting the way naming works here. She chooses to carry her mother's name into her married name, tethering herself to the woman who taught her what love looks like under impossible conditions, honoring her even as she also honors the husband who will eventually refuse to follow her to freedom. Their marriage is complicated from the start by the fact that Harriet is enslaved. Any children they have will be enslaved. The law is clear about this. Status follows the mother, and Harriet is someone's property. She knows this. She thinks about it. She talks in later years about how the fear of being sold further south, not out of Maryland entirely, but deeper into the cotton and sugar belt, deeper into the places where people go and don't come back, begins to harden into resolve during these years of her marriage. 1849. Edward Brodess is deep in debt. He has been trying to sell people, has already sold 3 of Harriet's sisters to places so far south and so final that they are as lost to the family as if they had died. He dies himself in March of 1849, and his death doesn't bring relief because his widow Eliza has the same debts and the same brutal solution available to her. The whispers moving through the enslaved quarters say that more people are going to be sold. Harriet starts planning. She talks to John about leaving. He tells her he will inform on her if she tries. Consider the specific terror of 1849 from inside Harriet's experience. Edward Brodess has died in March. His widow Eliza now controls the estate, which means Eliza now controls the people her husband owned. And Eliza has debts. Everyone on the Brodess property knows this, not because they were told, but because enslaved people are extraordinarily good at gathering information in environments that try to keep information from them. You listen. You pay attention when white people talk near you, because white people often forget to modulate their conversations around the people they've decided not to see. You piece together what you hear, and what Harriet pieces together in the spring of 1849 is that Eliza Brodess is talking to traders. Her sisters Lina and Maria Ritty and Soph were sold south years ago. They disappeared into the plantation system of the Deep South, and the family has had no word of them since. No word because there was no channel for word, because the slave trade didn't care about family communication, because the point of selling people south was to liquidate them as assets, and what happened to those assets after transfer was not considered part of the transaction. 3 sisters gone. Now the whispers suggest that more people will follow. Harriet's name may be on the list. Her brothers may be on the list. The Fugitive Slave Act is not yet law in March 1849. Millard Fillmore will sign it in September 1850. But the threat of sale is more immediate than any legislative change, and sale to the Deep South is a sentence from which there is no appeal. She acts. The plan she constructs is not impulsive. She has been watching the routes for years. She knows about the network, about Thomas Garrett, about the Quakers, about the free black communities in Philadelphia who have been receiving freedom seekers for decades. She knows which direction north is. She knows the land. She takes her brothers because they want to come, and she goes on the date she has calculated, a Saturday night, because nothing will appear in the newspaper until Monday, and they make some distance before the brothers' nerve fails them. Going back after the brothers insist on it is one of the hardest things she ever does, and it is not recounted as a defeat. It is recounted as the pause before the real beginning. A few nights later, alone now, no longer bound by the pace of anyone else's fear, she steps back into the dark, and this time she does not stop. September 17th, 1849. She goes. Her brothers Ben and Henry go with her initially. They get some distance before the anxiety overtakes them. A reward notice has appeared in the Cambridge Democrat, $100 each for their return, which is not an abstract number, which is a bounty that people will pursue. And the brothers decide to go back. They convince Harriet to come with them. They return to the plantation. Then, a few nights later, she goes again, this time alone. Before she leaves, she finds a woman she trusts, a woman named Mary, and she sings her a farewell. "I'll meet you in the morning," she sings, bound for the promised land. It is a goodbye that is also a code, and whether Mary understands it or not, Harriet does. She steps into the dark of the Maryland night, and the North Star is where it always is, and the marsh is under her feet, and she goes. 90 miles. She travels at night, navigating by the stars, and by the intimate knowledge of the eastern shore she has spent her whole life accumulating. During the day she hides, in haystacks, in root cellars, under brush in the marsh, in barns where sympathetic people have left the door unlocked. The Underground Railroad that she taps into is not, to be clear, a railroad. It is not underground in any literal sense. It is a network of human beings, black and white, Quaker and Methodist, free and escaped, who have made the individual decision that the law of the land is wrong, and they are not going to follow it. Thomas Garrett, a Quaker station master in Wilmington, Delaware, who estimates he helped over 2,000 freedom seekers during his years of operation, and who, when prosecuted and fined into bankruptcy by the courts, reportedly told the judge that since they had taken everything he had, he supposed he would have to go to work and make more, and he would then help even more people escape. William Still in Philadelphia, the son of a formerly enslaved man, who interviews every freedom seeker who comes through and keeps meticulous records, understanding that these names and stories matter, that someone will want them someday. A constellation of farms and churches and bold private citizens who have calculated that the risk of being caught helping is less important than the fact that people are suffering and they can help. Harriet moves through this network. The crossing into Pennsylvania is, in every account Harriet gives of it, a moment of almost overwhelming physical sensation rather than abstract emotion. She is not philosophical about it in the moment. She is in her body, in the specific body that has been cold and hungry and beaten and violated and worked and valued only for its productive capacity. And now that body is standing on ground where no one legally owns it. The sensation is so intense and so specific that she needs to check. She looks at her hands to see if they are the same hands. They are. She is. Philadelphia, in 1849, is a complicated freedom. It has a substantial free black population, one of the largest in the North, and it has an established network of anti-slavery support, and it has the black churches and the abolitionist societies and William Still, and all the infrastructure that makes it possible to arrive with nothing and survive. It also has racism. It also has the casual daily violence of a city where free black people can be legally free and socially restricted and economically marginalized and physically threatened in any number of ways that do not require anyone to claim they're breaking the law because the law accommodates them. Harriet has not arrived in heaven. She has arrived in a better situation. She knows the difference. She works as a domestic, cleaning houses, cooking, the labor economy available to black women in northern cities. She is fast, and she is thorough, and she is disciplined in the way that someone who has been doing hard physical labor since the age of 6 is disciplined, and she earns wages and she keeps them. And the act of keeping what she earns is so new that it has a distinct texture, a weight in the hand. This is her money. She earned it. She will keep it. She will use it. These are sentences that, for the first 27 years of her life, were not available to her, and she handles them with the care of someone who knows what it costs to get to the point of being able to say them. She is also, from the first days in Philadelphia, building. She is meeting people. She is learning how the network works on the northern end. She is building relationships with William Still's circle, with the women who run the Vigilance Committee, with the Quaker families who have been in this work for decades. She is, even in the first weeks of her freedom, thinking about going back. Not yet. Not until she knows how. But the thought is there, fully formed, waiting. She crosses into Pennsylvania, specifically into Philadelphia, and she looks at her hands, standing on free soil for the first time in her life, and she wonders if she is the same person. There was such a glory over everything, she will say later. The sun came like gold through the trees and over the fields, and I felt like I was in heaven. And then she thinks about her family, her mother and father, her brothers, her sisters who weren't sold. She is free, and she is alone, and the freedom feels incomplete in a way she will spend years trying to describe. I was a stranger in a strange land, she says. My father, my mother, my brothers and sisters and friends were all in Maryland, but I was free, and they should be free. She finds work in Philadelphia, domestic work, the labor most available to free black women in northern cities in this era. She cleans houses, she cooks, she earns wages that she gets to keep. She connects with the Philadelphia Anti-Slavery Society and with William Still, who records her story in the same notebooks, where he records everyone's story. She saves money. She learns how the network operates from the other side. she starts building the contacts she will need. And then, in the fall of 1850, the Fugitive Slave Act becomes law. President Millard Fillmore signs it because apparently the slaveholding states had examined the situation and decided that the existing misery was not quite systematic enough and needed a federal mandate requiring citizens of free states to actively assist in the capture and return of escaped people. Congratulations, America. The free states are no longer safe. Philadelphia is no longer safe. Any freedom seeker who has made it north can now be seized by slave catchers, operating with the full authority of federal law, and any person who helps them or hides them is subject to heavy fines and imprisonment. The terminus of the Underground Railroad has just moved 300 miles north, all the way to Canada. Harriet adds the math to her calculations and does not change her plans. December 1850. She goes back for the first time. She cannot go back to Dorchester County. She is a fugitive. There are people looking for her. Her face is known in the wrong circles. So she works through go-betweens, through trusted contacts, through the intricate chain of the network she has spent a year studying. Her niece, Keziah Jolly, and Keziah's 2 children are scheduled to be auctioned in Cambridge, Maryland. Harriet cannot appear, but she can arrange. She coordinates with Keziah's husband, John Bowley, a free black man, a ship's carpenter, and they time everything to the hour. At the auction, John Bowley makes the winning bid. Then, instead of taking delivery of his legally purchased wife in the way the auctioneer expects, he walks away with her while the auctioneer steps out for lunch. The auctioneer, when he returns, finds the auction is not where he left it. Keziah and her children and John Bowley are hidden in a private house in Cambridge until after dark. They sail north. They reach Baltimore, where Harriet is waiting. They travel to Philadelphia. They make it to Canada because the Fugitive Slave Act has made Canada the destination now. The first mission is a success, and Harriet has not left Pennsylvania. She goes back. She brings more people. She goes back again. Each time the risk is higher. Each time she knows the terrain better. Each time the people she leads are more afraid, and she is more certain. Because certainty is what she has built in the space where fear would otherwise live, and it holds. The route gets longer after the Fugitive Slave Act. The nights get colder as she pushes deeper into winter. None of it changes the outcome. She gets them there. Every single one. The rescue missions of the 1850s deserve more time than they usually get, because each one of them is its own extraordinary story of logistics and nerve. Consider what the work actually involves. She is traveling from Philadelphia or New York or Canada, free territory, into the state of Maryland, where she is a fugitive slave with a bounty on her head. She cannot appear in her own name. She cannot ask directions from most people she encounters. She is operating in territory that she left years ago and that has been actively looking for her since. She does this in winter when possible, because the cold cuts down on the foot traffic and the longer nights give her more darkness to work with, and the brutal conditions function as a kind of selection mechanism. Anyone who can make it through the Maryland marshland in January has already demonstrated they have what it takes to keep going. She uses disguises. On one occasion, she walks past her former enslaver carrying live chickens. She lets them loose when he gets too close, and the chaos of catching them covers her passage. On another, she boards a train heading south rather than north, because no one is watching for a fugitive heading towards slavery. She uses the white members of the network when their presence provides cover. She uses the free black networks, the churches, the watermen, the farmers, when trust requires someone who shares what she carries. She is a genius at reading the situation and choosing the tool that fits. The mechanics of the Saturday night departure deserve their own moment. She has calculated this specifically. If you leave on a Saturday, the earliest a runaway notice can appear in the local paper is Monday morning. Newspapers don't run Sunday editions, and notices have to be submitted before the print run. That buys 48 hours of invisibility before anyone official is looking. 48 hours, in the terrain she knows, is enough to be so far gone that the notice barely matters. She understands the information systems of the world that owns her. She understands its bureaucratic rhythms, its gaps, the specific windows where the machinery of control is not quite looking. She times her departures to fall inside those windows. This is not luck. This is the product of years of paying attention to how the system operates, studying it the way you study an opponent, finding the seams where it is weakest and moving through them before it can adjust. She uses a particular strategy with infants and small children, a necessary but brutal practicality. She administers paregoric, a tincture of opium used as a common medicine at the time, to babies who might cry at the wrong moment, to keep them quiet during the most dangerous passages. There is no good way to feel about this. It is the kind of decision that gets made in the middle of the night, when the alternative is everyone's death. And Harriet makes it and carries it, and it works. None of the children she brought through suffered permanent harm. All of them made it. The network around her is real and specific. Thomas Garrett, the Quaker station master in Wilmington, Delaware, becomes one of her most important partners. He has an almost comically defiant attitude toward the authorities who prosecute him for his work. When the court strips him of all his property to pay the fines they've assessed against him, Garrett stands up in court and tells the judge that since they have taken everything he has, he supposes he'll have to go to work and make more, and he intends to use it all to help more people escape. He is prosecuted multiple times. He keeps going. He and Harriet develop what can only be called a professional partnership of mutual admiration and practical utility. He provides shoes, money, letters of introduction, and safe harbor. She provides the actual route through the darkness that all the letters in the world can't substitute for. The Fugitive Slave Act changes not just the route, but the entire moral geography of the escape network. Before September 1850, reaching Pennsylvania meant reaching a society that at least officially refused to participate in slavery. After September 1850, that society is legally required to participate, to aid in capture, to return, to be complicit in the machinery they had been refusing. The free states are not free anymore, not for Harriet's passengers. Canada is the destination now. The journey grows by 300 miles. The cold grows more serious. The logistics of moving. People across the international border require new contacts, new routes, new safe houses in upstate New York and at the Niagara crossing. Harriet builds all of it. She learns the northern route the way she learned the southern one. On foot, in the dark, by doing it and memorizing what she finds. The network that ends in St. Catharines, Ontario, in the free black community that has been gathering there since the Slavery Abolition Act cleared British territory 30 years earlier, is real and warm and waiting. She gets people there, every time. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 changes the mathematics of the operation fundamentally. Before the act, getting to Pennsylvania meant getting to safety. After the act, Pennsylvania is hostile territory. Anyone can be legally required to assist in capturing someone who has escaped from slavery, and northern states that had built abolitionist cultures are now officially complicit in the system they oppose. Harriet adjusts. The route extends to Canada. She guides people to St. Catharines, Ontario, across Lake Erie, past the Niagara Falls, into British territory where American law cannot follow. Frederick Douglass knows a black community in Rochester, New York that becomes a key way station. She uses it. The routes lengthen. The journeys take longer. The cold gets harder. She keeps going. In one of the most famous episodes of her rescue career, though the exact details have been subject to historical dispute, she reportedly saves a mission by sending a warning through an unconventional channel when she suspects one of her intended passengers has had second thoughts and might give the group away. Whether the warning was delivered by letter, impossible for her to write, or by coded message through a trusted intermediary, or by another method, the mission succeeds and the passengers make it north. The story, however delivered, demonstrates what makes her operations extraordinary. She accounts for human failure. She plans not just for the best case, but for the moment when someone breaks under the pressure, and she has a contingency for that moment. Here is something about the Underground Railroad that the mythology tends to flatten into a single continuous operation, when the reality was a series of separate and independent cells. Local networks, relationships of trust built face-to-face over years, that had to be maintained and refreshed, and sometimes rebuilt from scratch when exposure threatened a particular link. Harriet understood this. She did not treat the network as a fixed infrastructure that she could rely on without maintenance. She cultivated relationships. She checked in. She developed the kind of operational security, varying her routes, timing her moves, keeping circles of knowledge small and specific, that any intelligence professional would recognize as sophisticated tradecraft, except that she developed it through experience rather than training, in the field rather than in a classroom, with the knowledge that failure meant death rather than demotion. The people she worked with understood this too. Thomas Garrett, who helped her repeatedly across the years of her rescue work, once told a court that after his prosecution and financial ruin, he had no intention of stopping. He would use whatever he could earn going forward to help more people escape. This was not bravado. It was the same kind of settled conviction that made Harriet take the gun out and point it at the person who wanted to turn back. The decision had been made. The line had been crossed. There was no version of the future in which the work stopped. The court had fined him into bankruptcy. He smiled and went back to work. There is a specific quality to people who have made an irrevocable decision. It shows in how they carry themselves. It shows in how they make eye contact. Harriet had it. Everyone who met her in those years commented on it. This quality of absolute settled certainty that was not aggressive, not loud, but simply present in her, the way gravity is present, as something that just is. The people she led to freedom felt it. It was why they followed. In the darkest moment of the journey, cold, lost, terrified, every instinct screaming to go back to the familiar misery. The presence of this woman, small and occasionally unconscious, and absolutely committed, was the thing that kept them moving. William Still recorded their arrivals. He wrote down their names and their stories, and those records survive, and they are one of the most important historical documents of the period, a first-person archive of freedom, built by a black man who understood that these names mattered, that these people were real and specific, that history was not just the documents that powerful people preserved. When you read Still's records today, and they have been published, you can read them. You are reading the names of people Harriet Tubman brought through the dark. Their names are Keziah and James and Araminta, Jacob and Henry and William. They are not abstractions. They are the people she went back for. There is a rhythm to how she operates that is worth understanding, because it is not the dramatic, spontaneous thing that the movies suggest. Harriet plans, she scouts, she times, she escapes on Saturday nights specifically because slave notices can't run in the newspaper until Monday, which buys 2 days before the alarm goes out. She disguises herself as an old man when she's walking near her former enslaver's territory, as an unremarkable woman when she needs to move in daylight. She uses the white conductors in the network when she needs to. Thomas Garrett gives her shoes, money, contacts, everything she needs, and she uses the black networks when she needs those. The free black communities in Delaware and Pennsylvania who have been in this work longer than the famous white abolitionists. She is, in everything she does, a professional, an operator, a person running complex logistics under life or death conditions. She carries a gun. This is not a detail that the popular mythology emphasizes, but it is a detail she herself emphasized when she talked about her missions. She carries a gun for the obvious reason, the people who are hunting her, and for a second reason that she is equally clear about. Sometimes, in the middle of a journey, one of the people she is leading would lose their nerve. The terror of what they were doing, the dark, the cold, the distance, the consequences of being caught, would close in on them, and they would want to go back. They would say they couldn't continue. They would say they would rather take their chances at home than die out here in the forest. And occasionally, they would threaten to turn back in a way that would compromise everyone else in the group, because a person who returns to their enslaver after a failed escape attempt has information, and that information has consequences for the people still running. Harriet Tubman would level her gun at that person and say, in the voice of someone who had made an irrevocable decision long ago, "You'll be free or you'll die, but you will not go back and take everyone else with you." She always meant it, and somehow, in all 13 missions, across all the years of the worst conditions imaginable, she never had to fire it. The certainty in her was enough. The specific, settled, bone-deep resolve of a woman who has already decided, has always already decided, was enough. She was, by every account, someone whose presence in a room changed the room, and she carried that quality into the dark of Maryland's forests, and it functioned there too. The numbers are worth setting straight here, because they have been embellished, and the embellishments have become the story. An 1868 biography by Sarah Bradford claims 19 missions and more than 300 people freed. These figures have been repeated so many times they feel like facts. More rigorous historical analysis, based on the actual records of the period, the anti-slavery society notes, the testimonies of participants, the work of historians like Kate Clifford Larson and Catherine Clinton, suggests approximately 13 missions and approximately 70 people directly conducted to freedom. Another 60 or so received detailed instructions from Harriet and made the journey on their own. The actual number is smaller than the myth. It is also staggering. 70 people. And the mathematics of what those 70 people went on to produce. Children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren. All the lives that branch out from a single act of freedom. That math has no end. Among those she brought out, her brother Robert, with his pregnant wife and children. Her brothers Henry and Ben and Moses. Her parents, Rit and Ben Ross, in June 1857. One of the most daring operations of her career. By the time she goes for her father Ben, he is a free man. Thompson has emancipated him. But Ben has been helping freedom seekers himself, and he is about to be arrested for it. Harriet travels to get him in broad daylight. buying herself a train ticket to avoid suspicion. When she reaches him, she blindfolds him. This is not theatre. This is strategy. Ben Ross will be questioned. When they question him, he will be able to say truthfully that he did not see the faces of anyone who passed through his care. He has not seen their faces. He tells the truth. The truth saves him. That is the kind of thinking Harriet Tubman does under pressure. Not just running the operation, but accounting for the legal aftermath, 3 steps ahead of it. By the late 1850s, her fame in the abolitionist network is significant. Frederick. Her relationship with Frederick Douglass in these years is worth more than a passing mention. They are, in certain ways, natural counterparts. Both escaped from Maryland slavery. Both become public figures in the abolitionist movement. Both embody what it means to refuse the identity that the slave system assigned you and build something else entirely in its place. But their methods diverge in ways that reflect their different temperaments and different assessments of the work. Douglass works through words, speeches, newspapers, the published narrative of his own life. He is building public opinion, making the moral case, operating in the arena of persuasion. Harriet works through action, quiet, specific, irreversible action that does not require public opinion to change before it helps the next person. She does not debate slavery. She ends it for the specific individuals she can reach. They admire each other. They are not doing the same thing. Both things need doing. Douglass, who has escaped from slavery himself and become the most prominent black voice in American public life, writes to her to say that he knows of no one who has done more for the liberation of enslaved people than she has. He means it as praise. He also means it as the observation of someone who has seen a great deal and understands what it costs. She meets John Brown in 1858. Brown is already a legend in certain circles and a monster in others. The man whose actions in Kansas during the violent struggle over slavery's expansion, and who is heading toward the raid on Harper's Ferry that will shake the country to its foundations. He wants Harriet's help. He calls her General Tubman in his letters, in his private conversations. He wants her to recruit for his plan. She does. She provides intelligence. She recruits. She is, in the weeks before the October 1859 raid, too ill to participate. There are the sleeping spells. There is the general wreckage the headaches have made of her schedule. And she is not there when Brown's raid on the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry goes wrong in the specific and catastrophic ways it goes wrong. Brown is captured. 2 of his sons die at Harper's Ferry. Brown is tried and hanged on December 2nd, 1859. Harriet grieves. She also understands what the raid accomplished even in failure. It proved to the slaveholding South that the question of slavery could not be indefinitely deferred, that there were people willing to die and kill for its abolition, and that the reckoning was coming. The country is cracking. The Civil War begins in April 1861. Harriet Tubman has been waiting her whole life for something like this, even if this is not quite what she was waiting for. Let's take a moment to talk about what her life looks like in the years just before the war, because the full texture of this woman is worth dwelling on. She's been living primarily in Auburn, New York, since 1859, in a house she purchases at a remarkably good price and through a genuine act of solidarity from William Henry Seward. Seward is one of the most powerful politicians in the country, a former New York governor and current United States Senator who will go on to become Abraham Lincoln's Secretary of State and the man who will negotiate the purchase of Alaska, which is why there's a joke about that being called Seward's Folly. He sells Harriet Tubman a house. He sells it to her on terms she can manage. This is her home base, the center of the small and rotating community of people she is sheltering and feeding and looking after. Her parents live there. Various relatives live there. People who are in transit live there. The house is never empty, and the resources to run it are always stretched thin. She cannot read or write. I want to stay with this for a moment, because it is so easy to absorb and move past. Harriet Tubman, who runs a spy network, who coordinates logistics across hundreds of miles, who navigates by stars and by the pattern of bird sounds and by the feeling of moss on the north side of trees, who will eventually guide 3 gunboats through a river seeded with Confederate mines, does all of this without the ability to write down a single word of her intelligence or read a single instruction that is handed to her in paper form. Everything she knows lives in her memory. Every contact, every safe house, every timing detail, every route, every face, every word, in her head. The people who study her work keep being astonished by this. They should be. She moves through the abolitionist circles of the Northeast with the particular authority of someone who has actually done the thing everyone else is arguing about in comfortable rooms. She knows Susan B. Anthony and Lucretia Mott and Martha Coffin Wright. She addresses women's rights conventions and anti-slavery meetings, standing before audiences that include some of the most prominent intellectuals in America. And she speaks without notes, without written remarks, without any of the apparatus that formal public speaking requires, and she commands every room, because her credentials are not on paper. Her credentials are the 70 people who made it. Her credentials are the fact that she walked away from slavery and then went back for her family, and then went back again, and then again, until there was no one left to bring. The network of free black churches along the eastern seaboard is the connective tissue of everything Harriet Tubman does, and it deserves more credit than it typically receives. The AME Zion Church in particular, the denomination that Harriet herself will worship in for most of her adult life, has been building infrastructure for freedom seekers since the early 1800s. Its congregations in Philadelphia, in New York, in the upstate New York towns that mark the route north are not passive sympathizers. They are active participants, hosting people in crisis, raising money, providing information, maintaining the safe house network that makes the whole system function. When Harriet walks into a black church in a town she has never visited before, she is walking into a community that has already decided whose side it is on. The church recognizes her because she is one of them. She is recognizable as someone doing the same work they are doing, just closer to the source of the danger. They help her because helping is what they built themselves to do. April 12th, 1861. The shelling of Fort Sumter, the Civil War. Harriet goes south in the spring of 1862, traveling to Beaufort, South Carolina, with Union military support. The official reason is nursing. The Union Army is dealing with thousands of formerly enslaved people pouring into Union lines as the Army advances through Confederate territory. People who are sick and starving and traumatized and speaking languages the white officers don't understand. Harriet can care for them. She can communicate with them. She knows plants. The low country of South Carolina has a medicinal flora she is quick to learn, and she uses it to treat the fever and dysentery that are tearing through the contraband camps at rates that official military medicine is struggling to address. She makes medicines from roots and from swamp plants, working knowledge she has assembled from a lifetime of moving through landscapes that most people treat as obstacles, and she treats as libraries. But nursing is not the primary work. The primary work is intelligence. Here is what Harriet Tubman understands that the Union Army, for all its maps and cavalry scouts, does not understand in the early years of the war, the most valuable intelligence assets in the Confederate South are the people doing the labor. The enslaved men and women working the plantations, driving the supply wagons, cooking the food, digging the fortifications. They see everything. They move through Confederate territory invisibly in the way that anyone who has been legally defined as property moves invisibly, overlooked, underestimated, functionally transparent to people who have stopped seeing them as a source of information. They know where the troops are positioned. They know which roads are moving supplies. They know where the river mines, called torpedoes, have been planted in the coastal channels. And they will tell Harriet, because Harriet is someone who looks like them and sounds like them, and has done what they are all dreaming about doing. And the trust that generates cannot be replicated by any white Union officer, no matter how well-intentioned. She builds a network. She recruits 8 scouts and pilots: Peter Barnes, Mott Blake, Sandy Salters, Solomon Gregory, Isaac Hayward, Gabriel Cohen, George Chisholm, and river pilots Samuel Hayward and Charles Simmons. Men who know every channel and current of the South Carolina coast. She runs a debriefing operation out of the Union-held areas, interviewing every formerly enslaved person who crosses into Union lines, pulling out every piece of intelligence they carry. She commits it all to memory. The whole network exists in the same extraordinary brain that navigated Dorchester County by starlight while running on a cracked skull. The Combahee River raid is worth spending more time with, because it is the kind of operation that reveals exactly what kind of intelligence professional Harriet Tubman had become in the decade and a half between her escape from Maryland and June 1863. Consider what it requires. She is guiding 3 ships carrying 300 men through a river channel that has been seeded with Confederate mines. Torpedoes, in the nomenclature of the time. She cannot read the charts they're using. She cannot write down the intelligence she has gathered. She carries the entire route in her memory, including the locations of mines that would kill everyone on those ships. Locations she knows because she interviewed the formerly enslaved men who were forced to plant them. Men who were willing to trade that information for the promise of what those ships represent. She guides 3 ships past death in the dark and delivers them to their objectives without a single casualty. The planning that makes this possible happens over months. She has been in South Carolina since 1862. She has been building the spy network, the 8 scouts, the river pilots, for months before the raid is planned. She has been interviewing every formerly enslaved person who crosses into Union lines, pulling out every piece of useful intelligence they carry, committing it to the extraordinary memory that has never failed her. When Colonel Montgomery asks her to guide the Combahee operation, she is ready because she has been preparing for it without necessarily knowing that this specific operation was what she was preparing for. She's been preparing the way she always prepared, systematically, patiently, attending to the details that would matter when the moment came. The Confederate response to the raid tells you something about how well it worked. After 750 people board those Union ships in the dark and the plantation infrastructure along the Combahee is destroyed, and the Confederate forces on the ground are scrambling to account for what just happened, the Confederates rush to build new defensive earthworks and batteries along the river. The raid proved the vulnerability. It proved the intelligence capacity that Harriet had assembled. Union commanders look at what happened on the Combahee and begin planning similar operations elsewhere. The raid proves that this model works, that a network built on trust between a black woman conductor and the enslaved people of the region can produce military intelligence of the highest order. They don't say it that way in the official reports, because the official reports do not particularly emphasize Harriet's role. But the operational conclusion is embedded in the follow-on planning. The model is Harriet. The model works. June 1st, 1863. Colonel James Montgomery, commanding the 2nd South Carolina Infantry, one of the new black Union regiments composed of freed men and former bondspeople who have chosen to fight, asks Harriet to guide a major raid up the Combahee River. The objectives: clear Confederate torpedoes from the channel so the Union ships can pass safely, destroy the infrastructure and food supplies of the wealthy rice plantations that line the banks, liberate as many enslaved people as possible, and recruit newly freed men into the Union Army. 3 ships leave Beaufort that evening: the John Adams, the Harriet A. Weed, and the Sentinel, carrying 300 men from the 2nd South Carolina, plus gunners from the 3rd Rhode Island Heavy Artillery, and Harriet Tubman, standing at the front of the John Adams in the dark of a South Carolina night, guiding the ship through channels seeded with mines, telling the pilot where to turn. She knows where the torpedoes are because the people who were forced to plant them told her. They told her because she asked, and because they trusted her, and because she had built a network specifically designed to collect exactly this kind of information. The ships move through the dark around things that would have killed everyone aboard if she hadn't been there. The channel is silent. The night holds. Around 2:30 in the morning on June 2nd, the ships divide to conduct separate operations along the river. And then, what happens is something that defies the clean narrative of military history. Word has gone out through Harriet's network, through the whisper lines that run through the enslaved communities of the Low Country faster than any telegraph, that the ships are coming, that tonight is the night, that the people should be ready at the water. When the Union boats land at the various plantations along the Combahee, the enslaved people are already moving. They come out of the rice fields in the dark. Women with iron pots of still steaming rice balanced on their heads. They are not leaving the food behind. They haven't had enough of it in so long that leaving it behind is not an option. Men with pigs in bags slung over their shoulders, the pigs squealing and outraged and completely non-negotiable about being taken. Babies tied around their parents' necks, or carried in arms, or handed to someone else for the boarding. The overseers tried to stop them. Confederate soldiers in the vicinity tried to stop them. Nobody can stop them. The tide has been building behind these particular banks for decades, and now it has broken, and nothing is going to reverse the direction of it. More than 750 people board those 3 ships before dawn. It is one of the largest single emancipations of enslaved people in the entire war. The rice plantations of the Haywood, Middleton, and Lowndes families, some of the wealthiest and most politically powerful families in the entire Confederacy, are stripped of food and supplies and set on fire. The agricultural infrastructure that feeds Confederate troops, and that these families have built on the backs of generations of forced labor burns. And Harriet Tubman stands on the deck of the John Adams and sings to encourage the people coming aboard. She sings Uncle Sam's Farm. Come along, don't be afraid. She is singing in the middle of an active military raid that she planned and executed. She later says the only problem with the whole thing was her dress. The press of people boarding damaged it. She was sorry about the dress. The abolitionist newspaper, the Boston Commonwealth, covers the raid and names her specifically, a black woman who led the raid and under whose inspiration it was originated and conducted. This is a northern newspaper in June of 1863, identifying a black woman as the organizer and commanding intelligence of a successful armed Union military operation. It is in print. It is there for anyone to read. And then the credit does what credit does. It follows the chain of command upward past the person who actually did the work, and Colonel Montgomery receives the commendations, and the reports go up the chain, and Harriet's name gradually recedes from the official record until she is a supporting character in her own operation. She does not receive combat pay. She does not receive a pension for her service. She sells homemade baked goods to feed herself while working for the United States Army. She will petition the government for back pay for 30 years. They will eventually give her a pension in 1899, but not for her service. For being the widow of Nelson Davis, a black Union soldier she married after the war. Not for what she did, for who she was married to. She is the first woman in American history to lead an armed military operation. That is the record. It is not informal. It is documented in contemporary newspapers. It took until 2024 for the state of Maryland to posthumously name her a brigadier general. After the Combahee raid, Harriet moves back into the conventional roles the Army finds easier to manage: cooking, nursing, general support. She serves the men of the famous 54th Massachusetts Infantry, including, she will claim later, cooking Colonel Robert Gould Shaw his last meal before the assault on Fort Wagner on July 18, 1863. Shaw and many of his men die in that assault. Harriet will visit the memorial to Shaw and the 54th in Boston 40 years later, and stand before the bronze monument and cry without speaking. And a journalist will describe her standing there, gazing at the faces of the dead. The war ends April 9, 1865. The Confederacy surrenders. The 13th Amendment, ratified in December, abolishes slavery throughout the United States. 4 million people are, in the eyes of the law, free. In the eyes of the law. The distance between legal freedom and actual freedom is the subject of the next several decades of American history, and Harriet Tubman will spend those decades refusing to look away from that distance. The Auburn that Harriet Tubman returns to after the Civil War is a specific place with a specific character that matters to understanding the last half of her life. Auburn, New York, in the 1860s and 1870s, is a small industrial city of maybe 15,000 people, sitting at the outlet of Owasco Lake in the Finger Lakes region. It is the kind of upstate New York town that has been shaped by the Erie Canal and the railroad and the particular abolitionist culture that runs through this part of the state like a vein of iron. William Henry Seward grew up here. The surrounding region is full of people who were active in the anti-slavery movement before the war and who are now navigating the complicated question of what comes after the war. The black community in Auburn is small, a few hundred people at most, and tightly knit in the way that small communities under collective pressure tend to be tightly knit. The Thompson AME Zion Church is its center. The church is not just a place of worship. It is a meeting hall, a community center, a space where the free black residents of Auburn can gather and organize and support each other in the ways that the broader civic life of the city does not always extend to them. Reconstruction is happening at the national level, and the 14th and 15th Amendments are expanding the formal rights of black citizens, and Auburn is not immune to the backlash against those expansions. The political climate of the late 1860s and 1870s shifts against the Reconstruction project in ways that the people living through it can feel in their daily lives. Harriet navigates this landscape with the same practical intelligence she brought to the marsh. She knows who can be trusted for what. She builds relationships across the racial line when those relationships are useful and genuine, and she maintains the primacy of her own community's needs when those relationships try to define her on terms that serve someone else. She is not the soft figure that comfortable white audiences sometimes want her to be, the gentle grandmother, the icon of patient suffering. She is Harriet Tubman, who carried a gun and told people they would be free or they would die. And that quality does not go away because the immediate crisis has changed. She grows vegetables, she raises pigs and chickens, she bakes bread and pies that she sells at the market on Saturdays. She takes in boarders. She takes in people who need somewhere to stay on a less formal basis. People passing through, people in crisis. People who have heard that Harriet Tubman's house is a place where you can go when you have nowhere else to go. The house on South Street is not large. It is not comfortable in any way that would satisfy a modern standard of comfort. But it is warm, and there is usually food, and Harriet runs it with the same combination of iron practicality and genuine warmth that she brought to everything else. She cannot manage the finances. This is not a moral failing or a character defect. It is the specific consequence of a life that has spent every available resource on other people, rather than on accumulation. She never had the years of steady income that allow the kind of savings that cushion a person against old age. The money she received for rescue work was minimal and irregular. The money she earned from nursing and scouting during the Civil War was minimal and late, and ultimately insufficient. The money she raises from speaking is real but not reliable. She is, for most of her adult life after the war, operating on the edge of insolvency, and the mortgage on the Auburn house is a recurring crisis that her community rallies around in the ways that communities rally when one of their central figures is in trouble. The petitioning of the government for back pay and pension is not a dignified process. It involves paperwork that she cannot complete herself because she cannot read or write, which means she depends on people who can to help her navigate a bureaucracy that is not designed to accommodate her situation. She petitions, she waits, she petitions again. The government acknowledges receipt and does very little. She continues to live on the proceeds of her garden and her baking and whatever her supporters can provide. And she continues to feed everyone who comes to her door because she has never been able to make herself close the door. She goes home to Auburn. Her parents are there, aging now, needing care. Her house needs repairs. She has no income, no pension, no formal compensation for the years she has spent first liberating people and then doing military intelligence work for the Union. She applies for back pay. The application goes into the system. She waits. She is around 40 years old. She has more than 50 years of life ahead of her. She gets to work. In 1868, Sarah Bradford, a white abolitionist from Geneva, New York, who has known Harriet for years and heard her stories and understands their importance, publishes a small book called Scenes in the Life of Harriet Tubman. It is drawn from Harriet's own testimony, recorded in Bradford's words because Harriet cannot write them herself. The proceeds go to Harriet to help with her debts. Bradford will publish a second expanded book in 1886 called Harriet Tubman, The Moses of Her People. These books are how many Americans first encounter her story. They are not complete. Bradford is working from a single perspective and with certain limitations. But they are the record that survives when no other record exists. Harriet Tubman cannot write her own story. She tells it to the people who can. 1869. She marries Nelson Davis, a Civil War veteran she met during her time in South Carolina. He is significantly younger than she is, about 22 years younger, which is a fact that contemporary observers noted with varying degrees of approval. Harriet Tubman marrying on her own terms, choosing a younger man, choosing love and partnership on the back half of a life that had already given her more than most people see in several lifetimes. She does it and does not apologize for it. Davis is a bricklayer, a skilled craftsman, a man of gentle character who will build her family a house with his own hands. He has tuberculosis, which will eventually kill him. They have 19 years together. In 1874, they adopt a baby girl and name her Gertie. This is Harriet's family in the years after everything. Nelson and Gertie and her parents and the steady stream of people who need somewhere to be, because the house on South Street in Auburn has never been anything other than a refuge for anyone who needs one, and Harriet has never known how to make it anything else. The 1870s and 1880s are years of increasing public life alongside continuing financial struggle. Harriet is a presence in the women's suffrage movement, appearing at conventions alongside Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton and the whole constellation of upstate New York women who are building the infrastructure of the fight for the vote. She speaks without notes, without the written remarks that everyone else carries, and she tells her stories, and the rooms go quiet, and then they erupt, because the stories are that thing that arguments about freedom always need and never quite have, the actual human weight of what it costs. She attends the founding meeting of the National Association of Colored Women in 1896, where she is received as an elder and a foundational figure. She sits in a room with some of the most accomplished black women in America, educators, journalists, activists, doctors, and her presence in that room is its own argument. She is in her mid-70s, and she has been doing this work since she was 6 years old, and she is not done. Nelson Davis dies in 1888. Harriet is widowed. She continues working. In 1896, she purchases 25 acres of land adjacent to her Auburn property, with a building on it, with the specific intention of converting that building into a home for elderly black people who have no resources and nowhere to go. These are people who were freed from slavery, but who have aged into poverty, who have no pensions, no social safety net, no family able to care for them, who exist at the margins of a freedom that came too late to accumulate the security it was supposed to mean. She's been talking about building this home for years. She does not have the money. She buys the land anyway. She works to raise funds. She gives speeches. She tells her stories. She is 74 years old. The Harriet Tubman home for the aged takes years to fully realize, and in 1903, she deeds the property to the Thompson A.M.E. Zion Church. Her church, the center of her spiritual life in Auburn for decades, with the condition that the church continue operating the home in perpetuity. She does not deed it to an institution, because she trusts institutions. She deeds it to her church because she trusts her people. There is a difference. In 1898, she undergoes brain surgery at Massachusetts General Hospital, a craniotomy. They open her skull to try to relieve the pressure and the pain that have been part of her daily existence since 1835. The surgeons offer her anesthesia. She refuses. She asks for a bullet to bite on instead, the way she has heard soldiers describe it in the war. She holds still while they operate on her. She recovers. She goes home to Auburn. Let's sit with that for a moment, in case the pace of this story has let it slip past you. A woman in her mid to late 70s who has had an untreated brain injury for 60 plus years submits to skull surgery without anesthesia because she has things to do and doesn't want the confusion of sedation, bites down on a bullet and holds still while they cut into her head, and then goes home and keeps working. Not as a metaphor, as what happened. Her last public years have a warmth to them that comes through in the accounts of people who knew her then. She is beloved in Auburn in the way that a person becomes beloved when they have been part of a community long enough and given enough of themselves to it that they are simply part of the landscape of the place. People visit. They sit with her in the garden. She tells stories. She still tells the Marsh stories, the Dorchester County stories, the feeling of the first night she walked into freedom. She still talks about crossing into Pennsylvania and looking at her hands to see if they were the same hands. The stories don't get smaller with the telling. They get cleaner. She does not speak at the end of her life with the nostalgia of someone who wishes she could go back to the most important moments. She speaks with the clarity of someone who is still in it, who still understands the work as ongoing, who does not experience her past as separate from her present, because the same principles that drove her through the Maryland marsh at 27 are driving her through the Auburn parlor at 85. The names have changed. The geography has changed. The particular form of the threat has changed. But the work of making sure that the people being left behind are not in fact left behind, of ensuring that freedom is not a word that stops at the end of a sentence. The work is the same. She plants her garden every spring until she cannot. She tends it herself when she can, and accepts help when she cannot. The garden is not decorative. The garden is food, which is survival, which is the same orientation she has always had toward the practical means of keeping people alive. The chickens lay, the vegetables come in. Whatever the garden produces goes to whoever is at the table, because there is always someone at the table. The people who visit her in her last years describe a woman who is diminished in body, but not in presence. She is small, and she has always been small, and now she is old, and the headaches have been her constant companion for 7 decades, and the sleeping spells come more frequently, and she tires more easily. But she is still herself in the ways that matter, still direct, still uninterested in anyone's comfortable version of the story, still willing to say exactly what she thinks about what is happening in the world around her, which in the early 20th century means the beginning of the long and terrible wave of racial terror that will define the first decades of the new century. The lynchings, the race massacres, the systematic dismantling of the gains of Reconstruction. She watches this happen, and she does not pretend it is not happening. She has never been in the business of looking away from what is. She tells the people who come to sit with her, "Do not be afraid." She does not tell them this as a platitude. She tells them this as someone who has navigated 90 miles of slave territory alone in the fall of 1849, and came out the other side, and then went back. Fear is real. Fear is information. Fear is not the end of the story. What you do with the fear is the story. The question of what Harriet Tubman's courage actually felt like from the inside is one she addresses directly when asked. She is not, she says, without fear. She prays before every mission. She asks God to protect her and the people she is bringing through, and to guide her feet to the right path. And then she goes. The fear and the faith exist simultaneously, she explains. One does not replace the other. You do not pray because you are fearless. You pray because you are afraid, and you go anyway, and you need the faith to be bigger than the fear. This is not a comfortable theology of divine protection from all harm. She has been harmed. She carries the harm in her skull. The faith she is describing is not the faith that says nothing bad will happen. It is the faith that says, whatever happens, I am not alone in it, and the work matters enough to keep going. That distinction between the faith that insulates you from suffering and the faith that accompanies you through it is one of the most important things she teaches, and she teaches it by living it every year for 91 years. She testifies before the House of Representatives on the question of her back pay and service recognition in the 1890s. She is in her mid-70s. She takes the train from Auburn to Washington. which is not a comfortable journey, and she appears before people with the power to recognize what she did, and she tells them plainly what she did. The committee listens with the attentiveness that powerful institutions reserve for people they have already decided they will not adequately accommodate. Nothing proportionate comes of it. She goes home to Auburn and keeps working on the home for the aged and keeps feeding whoever comes to her door. The public recognition of her last decade, the articles, the visits, the civic groups, is received with the same equanimity she has always brought to everything. She does not become effusive with gratitude for attention she deserved for 60 years. She accepts what is useful and redirects every conversation toward what is still needed, still unfinished. She is, to the end, oriented toward the future rather than the past. The past is where the story came from. The future is where the point of the story lives. And if the people sitting with her in that garden in Auburn can understand what the story is for, then the story is still doing its work. She is still doing her work. She will do it until the morning she says, "I go to prepare a place for you," and then she is done, and the work continues without her. Her health declines in the last years. The seizures are more frequent. The headaches, never fully absent, are worse. She is moved eventually into the home for the aged that she founded, which has its own particular poetry. The woman who built the refuge becomes the woman sheltered by it. She's cared for by people who understand what she built and why. People who sit with her and read to her because she could never read to herself. People who listen to her talk in the way that a community listens to someone who has carried the whole story. In February 1913, knowing she is near the end, she gathers the people around her. She says, in the words that those present will later record, "I go to prepare a place for you." March 10th, 1913. Harriet Tubman dies in Auburn, New York. She is approximately 91 years old. The woman who was born as someone else's property outlasts the institution that tried to define her by 6 decades. She lives to see the 13th Amendment, the 14th, the 15th. She lives to see the new century. She lives long enough to die in the home she built for people who had nowhere to go, surrounded by people who loved her. They give her a military funeral, the flag of the country she served, imperfectly, belatedly, with the profound, institutional reluctance of a government that told her she was 3/5 of a person and then spent decades trying to figure out what to do with the fact that she was clearly much more than that, is draped. She is buried with full military honors at Fort Hill Cemetery, not far from the house Seward sold her, not far from the church she worshipped in, not far from the home she gave to her people. A year later, Auburn declares a civic holiday. They unveil a plaque at the Cayuga County Courthouse. Booker T. Washington comes to speak. The community comes to mourn and to celebrate, which is the same thing when the person you've lost was the kind of person who turned everything she survived into something she gave away. And then history does what it always does to people who were too big for the categories available to them. It takes the full, complicated, weapon-carrying, brain surgery surviving, spy network running, home founding, suffrage fighting, 91 years of extraordinary living person, and it condenses her into the version that fits on a lesson plan. It keeps Moses. It keeps the lantern and the Underground Railroad. It loses the gun. It loses the visions and what they meant to her faith. It loses the Combahee River and the 750 people who boarded those ships. It loses the 30 years of petitioning for back pay that never came for the right reasons. It replaces the young woman described in her own runaway notice as of a chestnut color, fine-looking, and about 5 feet high, with the image of a bent old grandmother in a shawl, because that image is easier to put on a wall. Here is what should not be compressed. Araminta Ross was born into a system that owned her, a system built by law and reinforced by religion and defended by the government of the United States of America, a system that had been running for 200 years by the time she arrived, that had the weight of every institution the country possessed behind it, that had never been successfully dismantled anywhere it had fully taken root. And she was 6 years old, rocking someone else's baby in the dark, and she knew it was wrong. Not regrettably wrong, not unfortunately wrong. Wrong in the way that a thing can be so wrong that living within it feels like a wound that never closes. And she decided, somewhere between 6 years old and 27, that she was going to act accordingly. She did not wait for permission. She did not write a petition to her enslaver, or appeal to his conscience, or trust that the arc of history would bend on its own schedule. She memorized the marsh. She looked at the North Star. She went, and then she went back. And then she went back 12 more times with a gun in her hand and God in her chest and the names of 70 people she had committed to bring home. And she brought all of them home. And then she went to war. And then she built a home for the old and the poor. And then she fought for women's right to vote. And then she had surgery on her skull without anesthesia. And then she died at 91, having given everything she had to giving other people what they deserved. The question of Harriet Tubman's faith deserves more than a passing mention, because it is not peripheral to her story. It is structural. It is the load-bearing element of the entire enterprise. She is not a Christian in the comfortable, institutional sense that the word usually implies. She does not attend Sunday services primarily as a social obligation or a marker of respectability. She has a working relationship with God. She prays, she receives answers, she acts on those answers. And the answers are specific enough to be practically useful. They tell her which path is safe. They warn her when someone is about to betray her. They tell her when to move and when to stay still and when to trust a stranger. Whether this is divine communication or the extraordinary processing capability of a brain that has been rewired by trauma and trained by a lifetime of careful observation to read environmental cues at a speed that looks like intuition. She does not distinguish between these explanations. She is not interested in explaining the mechanism. The mechanism works. She prays constantly throughout her missions. She prays in the marsh. She prays while hiding in a haystack with 3 people pressed against her who cannot make a sound. She prays in farmhouses while the owners of the farm host her because their faith tells them to and their law forbids it. She tells a story later about a moment on one of her missions when she felt, with absolute certainty, that something was about to go wrong. A sense that came to her the way her visions always came, not as thought, but as sensation. And she changed her route, and the route she had been planning to take was the one where the patrol found it and found no one on it. She credits God. You can credit whatever you choose. The people she was leading made it north. Her faith is also the source of her endurance, in the particular way that a faith in divine purpose provides an explanation for suffering that mere human suffering cannot generate on its own. She has been hit in the head. She sleeps without warning in the middle of conversations and in the middle of forests and in the middle of operations that depend on her being awake. She has chronic pain. She has had years of poverty and of legal battles and of being told by every official structure she encounters that her contribution doesn't count the way a man's contribution counts. The thing that allows her to get up every morning and keep going. In the decades after the war, in the years of petitioning and building and fighting, is a certainty that she is supposed to be here and that the work is supposed to happen through her. You may find that framework insufficient. She finds it inexhaustible. She is also, it should be said, funny. Not the gentle irony funny of someone being careful about their image, but actually funny, sharp and dry, and willing to lean into the absurdity of what she has survived. She tells the story of the Combahee raid, and the detail she keeps returning to is the dress. She talks about the Southern whites who couldn't figure out who was organizing the escapes and kept assuming it must be a man. She talks about the gun with a frankness that makes audiences who were expecting a different kind of story lean forward in their chairs. There is a warmth in her accounts of even the darkest moments, not a minimizing of the darkness, but an insistence on the life inside it. People survived. People came through. People are living in Canada right now because of what happened in that marsh. That is not nothing. That is everything. There is also the question of what it means that she did all of this while disabled. Not disabled in the soft, cautious way the word sometimes gets used. Disabled in the specific, functional, daily sense of having a brain injury that could render her unconscious without warning, that caused chronic pain severe enough to follow her into battle and across years of outdoor work in brutal weather, that she managed with no medical treatment for most of her life beyond the herbal remedies she assembled from her own knowledge of the land. Her disability is part of her story in the way that most tellings still don't fully account for. She was not great in spite of the injury. She was great with it, through it, in the full context of a life that never gave her a day without it. The historian Deidre Cooper Owens has written about Harriet Tubman's centrality to disability history, the way her story offers a version of freedom where a disabled black woman is not on the margins but at the center, not the person being helped, but the person doing the helping, the person leading. That is not a footnote to her story. That is a structural argument about who gets to be the hero of the story of freedom, and the answer she lived out, without saying it in these terms, simply by being who she was and doing what she did, is everyone. Everyone who has the will, everyone who has decided, everyone who has looked at the thing that was supposed to stop them and kept walking anyway. And what Harriet Tubman proves, across 91 years of documented, witnessed, recorded life, is that the system was never as strong as the people who refused it. The system had the law, she had the marsh and the stars and the decision. The decision was enough. She was not a symbol. She was Rit's daughter. She was Ben's daughter. She was Minty, the one who preferred the marsh to the loom, who pulled muskrat traps in the cold water and paid attention to which way the river ran. She was the woman who woke up one morning with her skull cracked and started hearing God speak to her in her sleep, and decided that was information she should act on. She was the woman who loaded her passengers onto those ships on the Combahee River, while women climbed aboard with steaming pots of rice because they were not leaving the food behind. They'd worked too hard for that food. The food was theirs. She was the woman who held a bullet between her teeth while someone cut into her head and did not make a sound about it, because she had been through worse and she still had things to do. She was the woman who looked at her hands on the Pennsylvania state line and understood, for the first time in 27 years, that her hands were hers, and then she went back to get everyone else. So tonight, wherever you are in the world, whatever room you have tucked yourself into, whisper something quiet for her, not for the statue, not for the face on the coin that hasn't appeared yet, for Araminta, for Minty, for the girl who memorized the marsh, for the woman who looked at the stars and understood which direction was home, and decided that home was not a place she would build by herself when the people she loved were still behind her. They have given her monuments and cancelled her from currency, and named bridges after her and argued about what she deserves. She has received more credit in death than she received while alive, which would not surprise her. What she would want, what the entire arc of her life suggests she wanted, is not credit. It is continuation. It is the work going on. It is the next person finding the door she left open, walking through it, going back for someone else. She ran so that you could rest, not metaphorically. She ran through the literal dark of the actual world, and she brought people through, and she came back for more. And the chain of lives that follows from that decision runs unbroken to this moment, to you, listening in whatever soft and quiet space you've made for yourself tonight. Close your eyes. Let the dark be the dark of a Maryland forest. Let the stars be what they always were, fixed, reliable, pointing north. Somewhere ahead, through all of it, freedom. And somewhere behind you, trusting you completely, the people you came back for. You are bringing them home. Sleep well tonight. Rest in the knowledge that the most extraordinary thing about Harriet Tubman is not the missions or the raid or the surgery or even the 91 years. It is the decision she made over and over every time she could have stopped. The decision that what was right mattered more than what was safe. That is not history. That is instruction. Carry it with you. Good night.